Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here despite the rain and the sleet and all the fun stuff outside. My name is Paloma Celis Carvajal, and I think you were first.
Yeah, it's fine.
Sorry about that. I jumped in.
Okay. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Camilo Otero. I'm Artist Programs Manager here at Center for Book Arts. Welcome and thank you for attending Materialities of Contemporary Latin American Publishing. This event is organized by Karina Zeltzman and Alex Hidalgo in partnership with the Bibliographical Society of America as part of the programming of Bibliography Week. And for those of you who's first time at CBA, CBA is the oldest organization dedicated in America, dedicated to uplifting the book arts, and we have exhibitions programs like you've probably seen in our central gallery. We have a broad educational program with classes and workshops, and also studio access. So this space actually is a bindery as well, and then we have a print shop on the other side. I just wanted to let you know that the event is being recorded, and we were planning on live streaming it, but we're having some Wi-Fi issues today. So it will be recorded and up on YouTube afterwards. And now, without further ado, I want to introduce Paloma Celis Carvajal. Paloma is the curator of for Latin American, Iberian, and Latino studies for the New York Public Library. She was the bibliographer for the Ibero-American Studies collection at the University of Wisconsin-Madison from 2004 to 2018. In 2006, she founded the Cartonera Publishers Project at UW-Madison, which now consists of a collection of over 2,300 Cartonera books and the Cartonera Publishers Database, a digital archive of scans of book covers and metadata about these publications, plus audio interviews to several of these publishers. It has become the largest and most comprehensive collection worldwide. She has published and presented on the topic of Cartonera publishers in the US, Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and other places in Latin America. In 2009, she co-edited Academia Cartonera, a primer of Latin American Cartonera publishers, published by Parallel Press, UW-Madison, and co-organized the conference Cartonera Publishers, Recycling Latin American Bookscapes at UW-Madison. As elected president of the Seminar of Acquisition of Latin American Library Materials, she organized in 2016 the 51st annual conference at the University of Virginia, Nuestro Norte es el Sur, Mapping Resistance as Resilience in Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies. Welcome, Paloma.
I'll be very brief so we have time for our wonderful presentations. Thank you again for being here for this panel, which will be examining how actors associated with publishing have reimagined books as material objects in contemporary Latin America. While often situated on the periphery of global publishing markets, the region is a center of innovation where a range of projects, independent, state-funded, radically anti-capitalist, or a mixture of these, have proposed alternative ways of making, reading, and circulating books. Our panel features three scholars, wonderful scholars, who through a series of case studies from Mexico and Argentina, consider these projects and how they reflect in the materiality of books and digital platforms. I'll introduce them by their name and their affiliation and the title of their presentation. And they will be presenting, and after the presentations we will have some questions, a Q&A session too. So First, Magalí Rabasa. She's an associate professor of Hispanic Studies at Lewis and Clark College. She will be presenting the materiality of print books as a site of feminist translation. And then Nora Benedict, who's an assistant professor of Spanish and Digital Humanities at the University of Georgia, will be presenting Selling Crime by Subscription, W.M. Jackson and the Club de Novelas Laberinto. And finally, Elica Ortega, who is an assistant professor of Spanish at the University of Colorado Boulder, will be presenting Experimental and Independent Publishing in Mexico, Permanente, Obra, Negra, as an example of a distributed, I will say, unbook.
Not book.
Not book. Book with
not book.
crossed off the word. That's why unbook. So thank you so much for being here, and please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm going to get us started tonight. Thank you to Karina and Alex, who are in absentia. We're very grateful to for putting this panel together, and to Erin for all her work in making this happen, and also to the Center for Book Arts. I can't imagine a more exciting venue for this session, so thank you. A question that has long interested me is, what happens when a single book becomes multiple? What relations and processes are activated as a book travels across different territories and gets remade by different people in different places with different ideas, experiences, and materials? And how do those relations and that movement become visible through close examination of the object's materiality? The organizers of this panel invited us to present ideas on the materiality of books through the study of a single object. This was very challenging. I don't think I followed the assignment. Already I didn't, right? I'm not even going to talk about that book. As I thought about the countless books I've followed across the Americas through their many lives in the networks of radical presses that I work with, I decided to focus on one book that connects all of those many other books for me, which is perhaps unsurprisingly my own book. The book and movement, Autonomous Politics and the Lettered City Underground. Professional demands pretty much required that I publish my book as an English language university press edition. But the opportunity to reimagine it in Spanish in the non-academic circuits in which I'm also a participant was for me an opening to experiment with the practices I had followed in my research. A chance to imagine greater connection between the book's content, the book's relations, and the book's materiality through diverse modes of translation that extend far beyond language. Before sharing the story of the 4 versions of my book, I want to make clear that I'm not doing it because I think of my book as any kind of model, and I don't think of it as a book that does these things completely, correctly, or even well at all. It doesn't. In fact, my book's process allowed me to experience the shortcomings, limitations, and sometimes, many times, failures of these practices firsthand. In my earlier research, I worked with writers, presses, printers, and booksellers, and the social movements that accompany them to explore how the object of the print book is being transformed in the 21st century, not only through its interactions with digital technologies, but also with new forms of political and social organization. I developed the concept of the organic book to account for how the books produced in these radical networks are materializations of the politics they describe. This idea resonates with the ways that many of the presses that I work with imagine their projects. The editors of the Argentine press Hect Libros, Natalia Maldonado and Marina Winick, write, "A book can't be different from the magma of practices that have made it exist. This is the ethical slogan that guides us daily. It's a question of caring for what grows, not only what the books say, but also the connections with and between the people that make every book." End quote. So what happens to the relationship between what books say and the people that make the book as those objects become multiple and as they move across different territories? Key to my thinking about the materiality of print books as a site of translation are 2 main ideas. The first is a conceptualization of the print book not as a static object, this is not new to anyone in this room, of course, but rather as a potential site, process, and relation of experimentation, of care, and of prefiguration, through which the book becomes a means of imagining and practicing other, more just ways of being collectively in the world. The second key idea is an understanding of translation as a, quote, political practice, as translator Nancy Pinheiro insists, and of feminist translation as what Liz Mason-Deese calls situated translation. I'm also thinking with Patricia Hill Collins' insistence that feminist translation works to, and I quote, find ways to communicate with multiple interpretive communities without reinstalling power hierarchies that subordinated one to the other, end quote. This occurs in the linguistic register of a book, but also in its economic, political, social, cultural, aesthetic, and temporal elements. Feminist translation, in my view, extends far beyond the textual dimension to broader economies of knowledge. So through the story of how my book became a site, a process, and a relation of experimentation with what I had observed and examined in my earlier research, I want to explore the question of how the different operations of translation that materialize in the print book can be imagined as part of a feminist praxis of care, aimed at creating more just and equitable relations in publishing specifically. In what follows, I'll identify 5 aspects of the book's materiality that I suggest we can examine as potential sites of feminist translation. I'll present the first 2 in depth and just briefly mention the other 3 for the sake of time, but I would love to talk about those more later after the panel and the Q&A, whenever. I begin with the most obvious kind of translation, which takes up the most space in a print book, the linguistic translation of the main text. As I imagined what a translation of my book might look like, I was continually thinking about the long-term collaboration and friendship between Argentine militant researcher Veronica Feminista, currently a guest scholar at NYU for the semester, and US-based translator Liz Mason-Deese. In their most recent collaborations, their relationship is made visible in the book itself, as Liz sort of comes out of the shadows to which translators are typically relegated, making evident her role as co-writer and co-thinker. In her translator's forward to Feminist International, Liz describes the process in these ways. Quote, as the old adage goes, traductore traidore, translation is also an act of friendship and love, as well as a creative process. This manuscript was translated as it was written, chapter by chapter, over the course of nearly a year, accompanied by a constant dialogue between author and translator, as we both participated in feminist mobilizations, assemblies, seminars, exchanges, and debates. The first Spanish and English versions were edited simultaneously, sentence by sentence, often with the author and translator sitting side by side, writing and editing, mixing with translating, end quote. While this represents a rather exceptional process, it sparked questions in me about the relationship between translator, author, and book object, and the possibilities for departing from and even disrupting the conventions in publishing which tend to reproduce the historical feminization, undervalorization, and marginalization of the labor of translation. But while Liz's translations enable Vero's work to travel from south to north, my book's translation would do the opposite, bringing a book written and published in the north to the south. Though because the ideas presented in my book were largely formed and shaped and nourished by my experiences in the south, in a sense, what I sought with the translation, more than an initial travel from north to south, was a return of those ideas to the spaces from which they had emerged, to continue the conversation started there many years before. But despite all the goodwill and critical consciousness that I might want to claim, my process, like countless others, is also one born of a context shaped by problems of academic imperialism and intellectual extractivism. So the question that pushed me in my own process was one that I began to explore in the epilogue of my book. If, as Bolivian theorist Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui asserts, quote, ideas run like rivers from the south to the north, what does it mean to translate a text between English and Spanish for its travel from north to south while being mindful of the colonial and neo-colonial geopolitics of knowledge that shape such flows? I produced the first translation myself for a small zine edition of my book in 2016. I had submitted the full manuscript to a university press in 2015, but I knew that that would be a very slow, years-long process of peer review, revisions, contract negotiations, copy editing, and all the rest. So before traveling back to Buenos Aires for the 10th anniversary of the FLIA, the autonomous book fair that I had worked closely with there, I worked hastily to create a small zine-style edition in Spanish, published with the imprint of a small press that I had helped to found in Canada. One of many failed experiments, I should say. Don't look it up, it's dead. The imprint is there, it was a nice logo. My friend and translator Nancy Pinheiro was on call to copy edit each page as soon as I had it ready, and the small scale of that project meant that I was able to pay her for her labor using research funds. But when it came time to translate the full manuscript, we encountered the troubling realities of the economics of translation. My institutional and personal funds couldn't cover the true cost of the translation, which Nancy, who lives from her work as a translator, rightfully needed to be able to take on the project. Our search for grants and other sources of funding came up empty, confirming what we already knew. Translation too often is the result of best case scenario, uncompensated volunteer efforts, and worst case scenario, and most common case scenario, the exploitation of translators' labor. Both scenarios point to the absence of a transparent and effective economy in publishing to support this essential work. The editors at Tinta Limón, the press I worked with in Argentina, suggested a different translator, Ezequiel Gatto, who was interested in the text and eager to participate, and crucially, was willing and able to do the work for a much smaller fee, given his steady employment at as a university professor, which he uses very strategically to subsidize this kind of political editing work. We worked closely together as he translated the book, editing each chapter as it was ready. We faced difficulties in determining the linguistic register appropriate for the Spanish translation. On the one hand, we wanted to produce a translation that would have the greatest local resonance for this edition to be published in Buenos Aires. But on the other hand, given the economic obstacles, we knew this translation would also have to work for planned editions in other parts of Latin America. So while recognizing the impossibility of a universal Spanish, Ezequiel and I worked closely to find a middle ground between his Rioplatense Spanish and my Mexicana del otro lado Spanglish, if we're quite honest. Something that felt like both of us, but that would also read well in multiple contexts. Beyond the main text of the manuscript, though, linguistic translation leads us directly to another key site of translation in a book's materiality, and that's the cover. In 2021, this was brought to the mainstream with the hashtag translators on the cover, and Jeopardy. While it might not surprise us that this kind of recognition is not common practice in commercial publishing, it also remains very rare in radical publishing. When my book was preparing to go to print in Argentina, I was thrilled to see Ezequiel's name on the cover design. But when I received proofs of the Mexican cover, his name was absent until I asked the designer to include it. The problem of care in translation can begin with something as simple as whose name is on the cover of a book, but it also extends to involvement in the editing process, compensation for labor, participation in presentations, and much more. In my work with Ezequiel, we tried to think through those various issues and the kinds of practices we could activate to address them more carefully. Yet while Ezequiel has been very visible and active in very visible and present in the public life of the book, in many ways the desires and hopes for the transformative potential of this process fell short. We didn't offer him a space for a translator's forward or a forward, and his biography isn't included in the book, for example. My initial research was inspired by the question of why I was finding so many editions of certain titles published in quick succession in different parts of Latin America. Why weren't existing editions traveling across borders? Why were small local presses producing their own editions instead? The answer is, on the one hand, strictly practical. For these small presses and booksellers, the cost of shipping books internationally is simply prohibitive. But on the other hand, the answer is political. The presses are eager to translate the books to their own local political contexts through a variety of operations, which in most cases do not include linguistic translation, but rather many other modes through which the book becomes a part of a multi-directional conversation between different geographies and temporalities. The cover is the space where this is most immediately apparent, as local editors almost always opt to produce a new cover design, making a sort of creative, aesthetic, and cultural translation. I observed this initially in the many editions of Raúl Sibecki's Dispersing Power that I showed at the beginning, as well as in some of his other books, which at times even acquire new titles as they travel, like this one. This and many other aesthetic and cultural translations that I've examined on book covers led me to ask, how can a book cover serve to resituate and resignify a new edition for its local context? The book I referenced earlier, Veronica Gago's La Potencia Feminista, is a more recent example of this practice. First published in 2019, there are now at least a dozen different editions in print, each with a unique cover design. But the transformation between the Argentine and Mexican editions is particularly representative of the aesthetic and cultural translation a cover can perform. The Argentine edition features a contemporary painting depicting the women of Calama, who spent decades searching for the remains of their family members executed by Pinochet's caravan of death. The Mexican edition, in contrast, mobilizes a street art aesthetic using highly legible Mexican and feminist iconography. We have La Verita and we have the Mexico City Metro, which if you've been on it, you know that orange, right? That is the orange of the Mexico City Metro. And Ni Una Menos, right? Which could be other places too.
Yeah.
In both covers, the internationalist message of the book is combined with a grounding in local contexts, histories, and cultures. In the case of my book, the 4 covers also make visible this kind of political, the kind of political and publishing cultures from which they emerge. For the University Press edition, the photograph that I offered was swiftly rejected. They asked me what colors I liked. I said no purple. They came back with a purple design, which they changed to turquoise for me. But it was very clear in the ensuing process that I had very little voice in the matter. For my zine, given the urgency, I was the designer, and the cover needed to be Xeroxable, so the result was rustic at best, a rather hideous and overly literal visualization of the key concepts, book, movement, and the heavy-handed choice of a red and black aesthetic. For the Argentine edition, the editor suggested an aerial photograph from one of the autonomous book fairs. Immediately recognizable to the local audience that this particular edition, as the prologue very clearly signals, speaks to editors, writers, readers, and booksellers who move and work in these circuits in Argentina. To an outside reader, beyond that context, this design is rather unclear. For the Mexican edition, I worked directly with the designer, giving shape to the press's recent rebirth as a women's cooperative, Nan Garcia Villegas. Over WhatsApp video calls and texts, we had a series of conversations, and the end result I was pleased with was a rich illustration that calls up both the symbolic green of the feminist marea verde, or green tide, green wave, as well as the organic quality of the press's name, bajo tierra, underground, but very literally under earth, right? As well as the central concept of my book, the organic book. Unlike the Argentine edition, this cover doesn't directly allude to the site of its publication, but rather to the political culture of its new editor. The book cover is, of course, what wraps around the book's binding, leading to the next site of translation that I want to mention just very briefly. From cartonera presses that reclaim recycled cardboard within a solidarity economy, to zine cultures that embrace the tools of crude piracy as instruments of radical media, the materials and machines used to transform the loose pages of a manuscript into a durable cultural object reflect a great deal about the economic and cultural context of a book's production, as well as its circulation. So what can attention to the binding format of a book tell us about the processes, ethics, and relations that make it? A quick glance at the different editions of my book makes evident the vastly different tools and technologies available to and adopted by the different publishers. The economic concerns that often that both shape and drive the technical and material decisions of the presses also take form in what is often overlooked as the least interesting part of a book. The copyright page generally doesn't yield much fascinating or surprising information. I know this is a crowd that likes copyright. Still,
Just wait.
It's coming.
It's coming.
But I quickly realized that in the world of underground books that I'm working in, this is not the case at all. So this led me to ask how the political objectives and ethics that move these presses connect to decisions and strategies related to intellectual property. I found that it varies tremendously, with the IP practices emerging as a product of each writer's and press's circumstances, needs, and interests. And this page becomes a lively site of experimentation and creativity, where aspiration and imagination are put to work. Nearly all of the books represented on this slide are re-editions of books already in print elsewhere, so these pages are part of that translation that accompanies the book's movement. I've discussed this in greater detail elsewhere, including a BSA webinar a couple years ago, so for now, I'll just say that this aspect of the book can be a tremendously exciting space for thinking about economic and political translation, particularly in a book's travel between North and South. In the case of my book, it's a little less exciting, but you can also see different relations and practices in each of the editions. The many varied epilogues, prologues, forewords, etc. that accompany the rapid and vast travels of Raúl Sibecki's Dispersing Power left me with questions about the relations made visible and opened by these local and sometimes layered paratexts. What work can these paratexts do to orient to the local and readers, to the local and translocal relations that the books seek to activate? Working with Gérard Genette's idea of the paratext as threshold, not boundary, I look at these marginal textual elements as they're crucial to the ways that a book gets translated as it takes flight and lands in new places. The paratexts create connections not only across dispersed spatialities, but also diverse temporalities, especially in cases where there's a significant lapse in time between one edition and the next. The political translation at play, then, is about political space and political time. This also extends beyond the book object, as we can see in a particular kind of paratext that Gérard Genette calls epitext to account for its location outside the book itself. Epitexts, as you all know, are things like book reviews, but also the multimodal digital alter egos of the books in cyberspace, as well as live events where books are presented, celebrated, and discussed. These exist in the case of nearly every book, but perhaps most striking in the story of my book is an epitext produced in a context not represented in its pages, and that is Ecuador. One day in early 2022, my Instagram feed presented me with a terrific surprise from a press that I follow, Kikuyo Editorial, a brief manifesto for the organic book in the form of a digital graphic accompanied by a caption citing their encounter with my zine in Buenos Aires. With this epitext, the political translation is multiple. Translation into a new location, Ecuador, into a new format, a digital graphic, and into a new vernacular, Kikuyo's interpretation of the concept. Significantly here, the author of the book to which this epitext is connected, me, is completely decentered. I had no part in creating the manifesto, no knowledge of its production, and only learned about it through the kind of casual Instagram scrolling that fills too many minutes of too many days. Another set of posts from Kikuyo synthesizes how they and many others envision the transformative potential of radical publishing. The publishing house, a school, autonomy, a network, editing, a method. In closing, in a 1934 address to the Institute for the Study of Fascism, Walter Benjamin calls for a reorientation of the political utility of intellectual production by connecting agents historically separated under capitalism. He insists, quote, by experiencing his solidarity with the proletariat, the author as producer experiences, directly and simultaneously, his solidarity with other producers who until then meant little to him, end quote. This is what the organic book materializes or aspires to materialize, and which practices of feminist translation have the potential to expand and extend. The author becomes one among many producers of the book, and relations of solidarity are mobilized and materialized in the process and product of the book. So when the book is imagined as a space, as a process, and as a relation, it has the potential to be a site of feminist translation, and in this sense of feminist solidarity, of a feminist praxis of care, and of feminist internationalism. Attention to the book's materiality, between and across and far beyond its covers, provides a view of broader economies of knowledge and opens questions about the transformative possibilities that lie within them. Thank you.
So much like Magalí, I first want to thank everyone for being here. Lively crowd on a rainy night. Thank you to Erin for all of her efforts, to Corinne and Alex who can't be here, to Paloma for offering her wisdom, and to my lovely co-panelists here for their knowledge and wisdom as well. So I am going to go in kind of a completely different direction, but also talking a little bit about translation. And I should note that this is part of a larger project, so there are parts that are kind of left out here. But I wanted to start and say that some of you might know here in this crowd of lovely bibliographers, bibliophiles, the likes of Walter Montgomery Jackson, perhaps for his involvement in producing the 10th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, as well as developing its famed 11th edition. Some of you might associate him with founding the Grolier Society, through which he published the well-known children's encyclopedia, The Book of Knowledge. However, few might link his name to a Latin American publishing empire. That said, as early as 1908, Jackson set his stake in the book industry in Latin America, and by the time of his death in 1923, had become one of the greatest publishers of books in Spanish and Portuguese languages, and organizer of one of the most thorough distributing systems that South America ever had. What set Jackson apart from his competitors was his impressive ability to recognize lucrative publishing models and emulate them with great success. And one such example is his adaptation of North American Book of the Month clubs in Latin America. And he had many of these, a few that I'll mention briefly. The first of these is the Círculo Literario that was started in Argentina in 1947. And they produced a lot of the most recent novels of the time. He also had the Club Familiar del Libro that was publishing, in his own words, the immortal literary works. Here we have Oliver Twist. And exactly, immortal Oliver Twist. While all of these specific Book of the Month clubs are really fascinating and deserve more attention, I'm going to focus here on just one of these clubs that he started in the 1950s, and that is the Club de Novelas Laberinto in Mexico and Argentina. And I should note that there was a cover circulating in publicity here that had a Portuguese cover, and there is indeed a Brazilian form of this club that I've cut out from this shorter version, so I won't be talking about the Portuguese versions, but they do exist, so sorry for misadvertisement. So in particular, I'm going to talk about how this specific club accentuates Jackson's keen eye for profitable business models in book publishing, as well as his talent for identifying marketable trends in literature. Many of Jackson's successful publishing schemes in Latin America were adapted, as I mentioned, from tactics that other publishers had employed in other parts of the world with great success. His Club de Novelas Laberinto is no exception. In fact, Jackson's book club can be seen as a direct imitation of Harry Sherman's Book of the Month Club, which first launched in 1926 and continues today, albeit under different directorship. And for those of you who aren't familiar, you probably are though, with Sherman's original subscription-based plan. Subscribers agreed to buy one new book a month for a year, and they also received the guidance of a selecting committee who identified the Book of the Month, provided comments about it in the letter, and also generated a list of alternative selections for the subscribers. And Sherman's vision proved quite lucrative, and he acquired over 60,000 members in the first year of operation. And the decision to implement a negative option payment plan, basically forcing people, if you didn't want to receive the book, you had to say no. This helped him forecast the specific number of books that he needed to produce each month, which minimized the economic risks involved in the enterprise by limiting the amount of excess inventory. While there is no documentation or written account that ties any of Jackson's many book clubs to Sherman's or there are many Book of the Month clubs, I just focused on his since it's one of the first. We could also think about the Literary Guild as well. The similarities between these initiatives undoubtedly link them. Specifically, much like the US book clubs on which Latin American operations were modeled, all books produced for Jackson's various book clubs were sold by subscription only, and new members received one free book for joining, as well as a dividend for each 6 books purchased. Much like Sherman, Jackson also instituted a negative option plan, which was a positive thing for his excessive not producing too much inventory. That said, one major difference between Sherman's Book of the Month Club and Jackson's was the number of offshoots or subsidiary book clubs that were developed, which is precisely the kind that I'm dealing with here. Broadly speaking, each of Jackson's unique book clubs offered different types of reading materials for his publics, and on the whole, had favorable reception in almost all of the countries in which they operated. In an effort to develop a deeper understanding of the unique affordances of Latin American book clubs in comparison with what we might find in the US, I wanted to focus here on just one of these subsidiary book clubs, the Club de Novelas Laberinto, in terms of its organization, as well as the catalogs and types of materials that they were producing, as a way to think about the rationale for creating these smaller niche book clubs throughout Latin America. Unlike Jackson's other Book of the Month clubs that introduced readers to varying types of literature, like Oliver Twist, the Club de Novelas Laberinto exclusively produced the best works of detective fiction and mystery. While I don't have time or space here to go into the detail of the importance of detective fiction, I just want to mention the prevalence of this genre in the region during the mid-20th century, especially in Buenos Aires, which was kind of the seed for this specific book club, which might explain Jackson's initial decision to develop an entire subsidiary book club dedicated to this genre. That is to say, works of detective fiction were extremely popular and sold well in Latin America in series and other collections, and Jackson likely saw a key opportunity to capitalize on these local markets. While there is scant documentation on this specific Latin American book club, let alone virtually any of the other book clubs that he starts, we get a good sense of how it functioned, and perhaps more importantly, the types of readers whom it targeted through an analysis of extant advertisements in Spanish language periodicals. For instance, the 1953 issue of a Buenos Aires magazine entitled Libros de Hoy, Books of Today, announces the emergence of the book club. And here it says, "A most interesting announcement for the detective novel's millions of fans. The Club de Novelas Laberinto has been formed, which offers lovers of mysteries the most notable works from around the world, full of emotion, intrigue, and mystery." Apart from publicizing the creation of the book club itself, this advertisement also provides a great amount of detail about the production and distribution of books. Thus, we learn that there is an editorial board, much like many of Sherman's initiatives, that selects 2 detective fiction novels every month, purportedly the 2 best novels in any language for that month, and these titles are then sent to each member in the club. That said, each member is provided with a mailing, the Boletín Mensual, that describes the forthcoming titles in detail so that subscribers have the chance to opt out with that negative option of receiving certain books they might not be interested in reading. However, members must purchase a minimum of 8 of the 24 titles released every year, or 4 months worth of books. Along with this explanation of how the club operates, we also gain insight into the physical presentation of the volumes, and they're described as magnificently presented with a colorful dust jacket and elegantly bound, for the first time for detective novels in Spanish, and they will form a beautiful library. In line with Jackson's other subscription publishing sales, members need not pay for their books until after they receive them. From other advertisements, these printed in the Spanish periodical La Vanguardia Española, we learn that the purpose of the club is to, quote, bring together the thousands and thousands of passionate readers of detective fiction, which is currently very in fashion, by guiding them and providing them with a true selection of the best works of emotion, intrigue, and mystery. The header for this advertisement, and many others like it in similar periodicals, highlights the target audience as the millions of fans of the detective novel, and later refers to these same readers as the lovers of this mystery genre, which is intriguing for 2 reasons. First, it claims that there is a large reading public who will be interested in this new book club. Second, it establishes detective fiction as a popular and, by extension, in-demand literary genre, which re-emphasizes why Jackson would have been interested in creating a subsidiary book club dedicated to these types of works for as many Latin American readers. Another crucial link between the club and Jackson's earlier Book of the Month clubs is the circulation and distribution channels. We find the titles linked in particular to varying publishing firms, including Editorial Jackson in Buenos Aires, Editorial Cumbre in Mexico City, Editorial Éxito in Barcelona, and Editorial Obra de Chile in Santiago de Chile. The latter 3 firms were all subsidiaries of Jackson. As I mentioned, he has a lot of places, a lot of things going on there, which was a common marketing tactic that he used, and Jackson felt that creating these individual companies with, quote, a distinctive name often associated with the country would give them local character and consequently a competitive edge. While Editorial Jackson and Editorial Cumbre are the only publishing houses whose names appear on the title pages of the works in the club, Editorial Éxito and Editorial Obra de Chile were exclusive distributors for this Book of the Month club. In fact, the explicit objective of Editorial Éxito was the sales of Jackson's sets. And I failed to bring all of these objects with me, but this is a flyer that is in my collection that I was able to unearth from Editorial Éxito that lists the titles in this club and also has the similar language bolstering why interested parties might want to buy these books and be a member of the club. The Club de Novelas Laberinto had a much shorter run than other book clubs and only published titles as a part of the collection from 1953 until 1957, and the Portuguese branch of it ran until 1956, so a little bit shorter. Looking to the list of authors whose works make up the collection, we find several repeated names, such as Earl Stanley Gardner, Rex Stout, John Dixon Carr, and Ellery Queen, to name a few. Broadly speaking, virtually all of the works in this collection align with classic detective fiction and mystery writing in comparison with the North American or French hard-boiled traditions. It is worth pointing out that Earl Stanley Gardner's titles make up a staggering 30% of the entire catalog of titles, which is unsurprising given that he was considered the most popular whodunitor of his times. In fact, many of his novels, especially those in the Perry Mason series, were extremely successful and even adapted frequently for film, television, and radio. What is more, his name was already well known to many readers throughout the Spanish-speaking world, as his novels appeared in other detective fiction series such as the Biblioteca Obra in Spain. The likes of Ellery Queen and John Dixon Carr, who were both well known thanks to Jorge Luis Borges and his friend Adolfo Bioy Casares in Buenos Aires, similarly did not need any formal introduction. In terms of the physical attributes, the titles in this collection were available in hardcover or paperback format, and in some cases both. And an examination of extant copies of certain titles reveals that the specific format, whether hardcover or paperback, for Spanish language editions depended on the specific press that produced them. For instance, Rex Stout's La Muerte entre Horquilladas, which I chose as kind of a main example given that it's a translation of Murder by the Book, which felt very apt for today. I still have not, maybe the question of translation for markets. I've read this, there are orchids in it, but nothing to do with death by orchids, so I'm still trying to figure out how that works here. So if we look at this specific novel, it appears in both the paperback format with Editorial Jackson, which is the one on your right, and in a hardcover edition with Editorial Cumbre on the left. While these stylistic format changes might reflect the decision of these presses, it is important to keep in mind that all of the publishing firms in question were subsidiaries of Jackson and therefore inherently linked. Even though there are stylistic variations among the titles, especially between paperback and hardcover, we find a number of overlapping design features in the collection. For starters, the same unique logo adorns the cover of every book published in the collection. Oh, and I included, as I promised, the Portuguese version there, which is in the longer format, but it exists. So we see the logos here, and so there are slight differentiations here, mainly the vertical orientation used for the paperbacks and the horizontal for the hardcover. All of the information and design details are shared across the logos. In tandem with these logos, we also find the tagline, "The best works of mystery and detective fiction," printed on virtually all of the books in the collection. Another design element that is shared is the use of elaborate color illustrations, or cover illustrations rather. Thus, we find unique drawings on each cover, black and white for the paperback and color images for the dust jackets of the hardcover editions. And no two images are repeated or reused in the entire collection. The final shared design feature across the works is the inclusion of a brief plot summary of the title in question along with a short author biography. And these textual elements appear in different places depending on the format, but their presence on all of the books signals their importance. That said, it is important to highlight the fact that the summaries and author biographies differ across formats, which is most likely a function of space, more space on the dust jacket than on the paperback. In other words, there are truncated plot summaries and author biographies on the back cover of the paperback and more detailed text on the inside flaps of the dust jackets on the hardcover editions. And even though there are a significant number of overlaps, we also find several attributes that are unique to each distinct format. For instance, the paperback editions have a much more uniform design layout across titles, and these are a few that I pulled here. While the cover illustrations are different for each title, they all appear in the black and white image in the center and have a similar aesthetic. And the color blocking scheme here is the same for every book, even if the choice of colors might change depending on the title. And here, this kind of tripartite is reminiscent perhaps of Penguin, but there are also at least one publishing house in Latin America, Editorial Sudamericana, who uses a similar kind of tripartite blocking scheme. Finally, the paperback editions list other successes of our publishing house, which highlights the financial success of this club. A key feature that sets the hardcover editions apart from the paperbacks is the use of a dust jacket. Moreover, the dust jackets that adorn each hardcover book in the collection present bright, flashy, and eye-catching illustrations. Some of my favorite here, there are lots that are very interesting. That is to say, publishing houses produced, this is kind of in line with other detection fiction series that were published by other firms, which tended to take advantage of the sensational elements to help grab the attention of passersby and entice them to purchase these titles. Who wouldn't want to buy El Gato Ladrón? Like, what's going on there? Along with these full-cover, brightly colored illustrations, the dust jackets of the hardcover editions also presented readers with a similar, smaller original illustration on the back cover that seemed to match central themes. And on Murder by the Book, or La Muerte entre Horquilladas, we see this little illustration on the back there. Of course, Murder by the Book there. Several of the aspects of the club that set it apart from other 20th century detective fiction series produced in Latin America, or there are several things that set it apart. First and foremost is the way in which the titles in the collection were sold and made available to readers. In light of the fact that there were so many detective fiction series in circulation throughout Latin America, Jackson's decision to establish the club as a Book of the Month club, i.e. through a subscription publishing model, distinguished this collection from all other contemporary competitors. And to my knowledge, this is the only Book of the Month club that uses a subscription publishing model in Latin America that focused exclusively on detective fiction. The more common models for selling and distributing this type of literature throughout the world was through kiosks or news agents. Moreover, the fact that each title that would appear in the club was predetermined and already selected was a particularly apt model for new and curious readers who were unsure where to start or which novels to read first. However, as previously noted, subscribers would ultimately have the ability to opt out of purchasing certain titles if they were not interested in the summaries provided to them. Thus, they did have some level of autonomy. In line with Jackson's other publishing ventures, the success of the CNL relied on an extensive advertising and marketing campaign, which set it apart from other detective fiction collections in Spanish-speaking countries. And it was quite extensive. There were anecdotes of him producing upwards of 2 million circulars and advertisements to be kind of dropped in people's mailboxes, which is a huge amount for the time. In short, Jackson's impressive marketing strategies for this group, from massive advertisement campaigns to subscription publishing model, differentiated it from comparable detective fiction collections in Latin America. Throughout his lengthy career, Jackson adapted a variety of international trends in the publishing industry for Latin American markets, from the development and translation of encyclopedic sets to books sold through the subscription publishing model. What is more, many of his marketing strategies show an interest in speaking to local and regional interests, which was quite a novel practice for the time. As we have seen, the Club de Novelas Laberinto shares a number of features with both Anglophone Book of the Month clubs and Latin American crime collections. More specifically, it utilizes a globally successful model, the Book of the Month Club, to package locally popular content, works of detective and crime fiction, or what we might call a proto-global model. Even though Jackson's Club did not include local detective fiction authors among its published volumes, the theme of the collection itself supports local trends and popular genres that would have attracted a variety of Latin American readers at the time. The use of such a model for this Book of the Month club benefited Jackson in 3 important ways. First, by relying on local resources in the form of his own printing presses and binding factories in situ, he developed an extremely cost-effective book club that had much lower production costs in comparison with Anglophone publishers who had to produce books outside of Latin America and then deal with costly shipping and importation taxes. Second, and perhaps a corollary of this previous point, is Jackson's ability to achieve an economy of scale with his Book of the Month club by having offices, production plants, and distribution facilities in many separate Spanish and Portuguese-speaking countries. Finally, by creating local branding in the form of uniquely named subsidiaries and content, he appealed to Latin American readers and personalized his Book of the Month club so that it would not resemble those of his competitors. Above all, what we find through an analysis of the Club de Novelas Laberintos is Jackson's unparalleled ability to package, market, and sell books for a variety of readers throughout the globe, regardless of their linguistic and cultural differences.
Well, I also want to echo my thanks to Erin for organizing everything, Karina and Alex for organizing the panel, Paloma, my co-panelists, and everyone here for braving the January rain. So I guess as it's customary, this is also part of a much larger project in which I've collected a series of contemporary literature from the last 40 years, more or less, that are published both as a print book and some kind of digital or electronic application. And this is particular to this book. I brought a copy here if anybody would like to take a look and circulate around. This is Permanente, Obra, Negra by Mexican writer Viviana Benchushen that I'm using as an example of a distributed notebook. Let's go with notebook. And I don't want to explain that. Hopefully by the end of the talk you know why this is happening. So I'll just go ahead. Viviana Benchushen's Permanente, Obra, Negra is a unique piece of experimental literature that takes upon itself the significant task to interrogate the form of the book, both as meaning-making object and as a commodity produced within neoliberal markets. Published in 2019 by the Mexican independent publisher Sexto Piso, Permanente Obra Negra is a complex gathering of book objects. A trade edition book that you have circulating around, a die-cut book that we have right here, a card catalog, and a web application. That was designed by Dora Bartilotti and Leonardo Aranda at the Media Lab MX. Relying on 4 deftly designed material objects and the instances where they intersect and pull apart, Abendschuhen builds a device of distributed book objects through which her readers engage in a process of selection, collation, and combination of short passages producing countless reading paths and modes. A profoundly self-reflexive work, Permanente Obra Negra centers on an exploration of the history of writing and the book in the West, it's pretty ambitious, critique from a perspective of accumulation through dispossession, colonialism, slavery, and ghostwriting. To study books like Permanente Obra Negra, I advance the notion of loose binding, and we're going back to the bindings. Loosely bound books are single works despite their multiple facets. In order to consider them so, instead of as editions, adaptations, or attachments to each other, loose bindings must be thought of as a remediation or a transfer of the affordances of a book's binding onto bespoke literary and bookish strategies to attach, join, or fasten together 2 or more book objects. As I elaborate, loose bindings in the larger project, that is, loose bindings are the basis to establish the meanings of a distributed book by means as varied as design and production that can be observed in the Paratexts. I'm going to show you some Paratexts as well as narrative strategies and reading practices. Further, I argue that this type of creation is symptomatic of the observable changes in literary creativity, publishing, and reading at the turn of the 21st century. Due to its complexity, I'm going to spend a few minutes offering an overview of the themes and the structure of the novel. As the title in Spanish suggests, this is a work in a constant process of becoming. Obra Negra refers to an unfinished construction, a building usually made of just bricks and cement or a rough inn. The unfinished construction metaphor enables Abendschuhen to stage the very process of writing and to labor a myriad fragments, starting points, notes, sources, images, and possible storylines for the reader to finish it. Comprising more than 1,000 fragments across the 4 book objects, the text is organized in 6 autonomous yet connected series. Each has a narrative thread and a distinctive typeface, as we can see in this photo of the index of sorts that comes in the trade edition. We have, for example, Baskerville first series, the Permanent Roughing, which explores the process of writing the text, engaging the reader in the particularities of the book itself. Bodoni's second series, The Archive of Black Writing, establishes the relationships between slavery, blackness, and writing. Corbel, third series, the inexpert novel, provisional title, tells a story of the dissociative, transactional, and plagiarizing process of ghostwriting. Adobe Caslon Pro, fourth series, the Book of Epigraphs, is a collection of reflections on writing by various authors and thinkers. Franklin Gothic Medium, fifth series, the Index Card Artist, presents a history of the index card as a medium of writing. And finally, Eurostyle sixth series, the User Manual, Instrucciones de Uso, offers tongue-in-cheek and as well as serious guidance to reading the novel, and also an archive of visual representations of the book. Structurally, it is important also to note that the 6 series have a designated space in each of the 4 facets. In the card catalog that we can see right now, each fragment is a card, and cards are separated by 6 series, in the 6 series by the tabs. In the trade edition, as we were seeing also in the index, each series occupies one of 6 positions: the top verso, middle verso, bottom verso, top recto, middle recto, bottom recto. The same distribution of the series exists in the die-cut book. It's actually the exact same printing, and we can see, for example, the page numbers that remain from the trade edition into the die-cut book too. And on the website, once again, each fragment is a card that is randomly dealt to the reader after pulling the handle with this manicule that runs the script that randomizes the cards that we get. As with all other design and narrative elements, this distribution amplifies the combinatorial possibilities and the multiple paths for finishing the novel. Indeed, the experience of reading Permanente, Obra, Negra is really hard to handle. It's hard to know how much you read, how much you have to read, what kind of direction you're going to take. It's really just a little maddening and fascinating in that way. I spend a lot of time with this book. Now I wish to turn your attention back to the idea of loose binding. At the basis of this notion is how a book's binding is first and foremost a structural feature, one that is going to give form to a codex. However, the text block of print text is joined together beyond just physical proximity. It is also fastened together conceptually as a finite and bounded set of information. I take inspiration from the work of the Multigraph Collective, for whom binding is a deliberate act that creates meaning through the presentation and collation of the leaves it encloses. I use this to propose that a book's binding is also a semantic feature, particularly in these kinds of projects. Moreover, on this basis, we can think of bindings not just as the physical and structural features of codices, but as critical markers of conceptual, aesthetic, and political meanings. In the case of the Paratexts that we're going to look at, we're going to see how these, political intentions of Abendschützen really touch upon the publishing practices a little bit that touches on what Magalí was presenting about too. So loosely bound books and other print digital literary works like Permanente, Obra, Negra rely on bespoke mechanisms to fasten together different book objects. Loose bindings then consist of establishing these mechanisms to signal both an overflowing of the book, the unboundedness, this kind of like tendency to expand, and the capaciousness and flexibility or the boundedness of the book as well. If one of the primary functions of a book's binding is to keep leaves and sections together in a given and deliberate order, then the seemingly contradictory notion of loose binding displaces these functions into alternative materials, processes, or marks while retaining their intent. Instructions for reading between objects, running software, titles, and content, that can be narrative or visual, become these fasteners. Further, if, as discussed above, a book's binding is critical to the creation of meaning, a loose binding does not mean an absence of meaning, but rather the production of this meaning through the tension created by a work's boundedness and unboundedness. The questions opened by these characteristics, I believe I skipped a slide. Yes, there it is. The question opened by these characteristics is how Abendschützen ensures that the four facets of her work maintain a sense of cohesion, how they make meaning together in addition to making meaning by themselves. An examination of the volumes themselves begins to offer evidence of their connection, aside from the recognizable title, author, and visual design, I guess. The contradictory dynamic of boundedness and unboundedness can be readily seen in the paratextual information. This is particularly important because compared with similar print digital works, Permanente, Obra, Negra is unique in that its four book objects are not found, sold, or distributed together or bound by means of packaging. That is, in the 90s, we see a lot of CD-ROMs stuck in back covers or diskettes as well. This is not happening in this case, so the juxtaposition is interesting. Indeed, the volume's Paratexts reveal the web of objects woven by Abendschützen as the whole project, from its conceptualization and design through the various production processes. And this is where we're going to start to look at some Paratexts. So the copyright page and the colophon, for starters. In the card catalog, I should say this is again the same one that we would find in the die-cut book. The card catalog is a little bit different because the copyright page is divided into two cards, whereas the colophon is just one card. And the web application that has totally different sort of Paratexts because the production is very different. These paratexts are useful for tracking the different production and design trajectories, such as layout, book design, printing, binding, programming, interface design, and crucially, the overall conceptualization. Following these trajectories provides evidence of the autonomy of each object, yet when reading them all together, we can observe a relationship of complementariness, for example, in the printing and binding locations. And here I have more. Here we can see, for example, the trade book was printed at Offset Rebosan, whereas the card catalog was printed at Nova Graphicos, but it was bound, both the card catalog as well as the die-cut book were bound at Taller Aleph. Once again, it is very different path of production in the case of the web application. So this reveals the different facets in the sense of unboundedness. They have an autonomy that follow a different production process, essentially. However, when we look at the color fun, this is where it starts to get really fun, very fun. We start to see that there's also markers in the Paratexts that have the opposite effect of bringing together the different objects, and this is the case where we can see. I have a translation for this. The print run for this rough-in includes 1,800 copies in ivory 90-gram bond paper, 200 die-cut copies in ivory 90-gram bond paper, and 100 card catalogs in 180-gram Bristol cardstock. So they are really being considered as one single edition, one single print run, so the opposite effect. The production trajectory is discernible from the paratextual information, also weave a web of collaborators, all of whom Aben Shushan and Sexto Piso have chosen not to obfuscate under the author's name or the publisher's imprint. We can look at it here, the collaborators. So we have Formación, layout. We have Taller de Alejandro Magallanes, Luigi Amara, Ana Laura Alba, Mariana Ugalde, and then the design. Alejandro Magallanes, who is an absolutely brilliant book designer, by the way, and Vivian Aben Shushan in the trade edition. In the card catalog, we see similar kind of credit and very different credits in the web application. But this is something that does not get obfuscated just by this was done on this imprint and it's kind of like done in-house, I guess. In the same manner, in the copyright and about page is a legend that explains what objects constitute Permanente Obra Negra. Interestingly, these are also the acknowledgements of the funding source, Fundación BBA Bancomer, that you can already see here, but I want to point them out here. If we read this small kind of like legends that indicate the scope of a project, we can see the publication of this multiple book, card catalog, algorithm online was made possible thanks to the support of Fundación BBA Bancomer. In the other one, the production of this multiple book, die-cut book, card catalog, algorithm was made possible thanks to the support of Fundación BBVA Bancomer. And I have this in the previous slide. This is a textual artifact conceived as a card catalog, that is, as a mechanism of permutating fragments and non-linear reading, written on a 4x6 index cards, and which circulate in several media. A card catalog, a book of montages, a die-cut book, an algorithm. This project was made possible thanks to the support of Fundación BBVA Bancomer and Proyecto B. On first view, this legend simply lists the instances of the work, though in slightly different wording. However, the explicit reference to all facets can be attributed to the funding agency's grant conditions, which require the acknowledgement of all aspects and outputs of the funded project. Consequently, we can see the imprint of Fundación BBVA Bancomer on all 4 objects, while those of Sexto Piso and Media Lab MX only appear on the items produced by each. While a funding agency can hardly be thought of as a publisher, it is clear that visually, pragmatically, and of course financially, it still impacts the cohesion of the work. Ultimately, it was through that financing source and the industry collaborations it facilitated that Aben Shushan was able to, and I want to say miraculously, publish or launch all 4 facets simultaneously. I really think it's a monumental endeavor. The paratextual evidence suggests that publishing conventions, traces of an individual object's production are also mechanisms of loose binding. While conceptually it may be challenging to tell where one facet of Permanente Obra Negra is independent from another, the marks of the publishing process signal their discreteness. Conversely, the imprint of the publisher Sexto Piso, which accompanies the three print objects, and that of Fundación I've said it so many times, BBVA Bancomer, found in all four facets, hint at Benchushan's overarching conceptualization and realization of the project. The concomitant infrastructure and procedures of well-designed publishing and funding, which might seem accessory to the mechanisms at play in Permanente Obra Negra, become crucial in understanding how the work is loosely bound. As it becomes evident from the paratextual information, I should say there's also many other ways in which Benchushan is playing with this dispersion and cohesion in the work. This is just the most interesting visually. As it becomes evident from a paratextual information, the loose binding mechanisms also put forward the author's politics regarding publishing and authorship, as seen in the expanded credits and copyright page, and the complementary role of the book in the present media ecology, as seen in the list of facets listed in each object. Further, the examination of the paratext in Permanente Obra Negra reveals that, unlike a physical binding, a loose binding does not designate a particular ordering, but it does signal a relating of the multiple facets and makes meaning through the various ways to fasten and collate the distributed objects. Just in conclusion. Even when works like Permanente Obra Negra emerge out of experimental writing and independent publishing circles, this type of book is really not that rare anymore, and we find this kind of hybrid publishing in many different publishing circles, which suggests that the shifting role of the book in literary creation, one that both encodes and precipitates the changing sensibilities of readers used to following content across distributed objects and platforms, as well as the modification of literary publishing practices, where the book continues to be central but no longer singular. The characteristics of Permanente Obra Negra compel and allow us to expand our understanding of binding, especially in the unstable media ecology of the turn of the 21st century, where there seems to be a tendency towards distributedness and fragmentariness. The dramatic shifts in reading practices, book editing, and production seen in the textual media ecology of the last 4 decades similarly compel us to further theorize them as modifications to the contemporary forms of the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Should we start with questions? Does anybody have any questions they want to start on the speaker? I have a ton of questions. I'd rather have others.
I'm thinking all of that. I actually have a question on the detective novels. And
Oh,
I
yeah.
just want to confirm, because I think I heard this correctly, but I just want to make sure. Did you say that those, for all of the series were not featuring local authors?
They weren't. I think there is one, I don't remember exactly, because I think there are only about, in the Spanish language, not thinking about the Portuguese, because there are less Portuguese titles, and there is a lot of overlap between the two book clubs, but the Spanish language one has more and slightly different titles than the Portuguese collection. But I think there is one author who might be considered, I can't remember which one it was, but might be considered local through like a series of weird translations, but for the most part they are kind of all imported, translated authors, not from either Buenos Aires or Mexico City in the case of the presses themselves, but they would have been known in the circles given other collections.
I'll follow up with one for detectives. How did you get access to all those books? I think as a librarian, like,
So,
who would have the dust jackets?
yeah,
the
so actually,
paperbacks and-
in my spare time, which is few and far between, I collect these things,
Also,
because
it's your
they're,
personal collection.
yes, so
What
all of
shows?
these,
Yeah.
yes.
Wow.
I don't have, I'm working towards slowly collecting them, so right now my catalog of access to them consists of like rare antiquarian websites, but mainly Mercado Libre and throughout Latin America, where they tend to have really great images and interior, and you can email the sellers and say, hey, can you tell me, like, send me the colophon, I want to look at it, and they actually tend to list who the translators are, which is lovely. So from that, I create kind of a whole, I have a huge Excel document with all of the kind of paratextual information, but a whole kind of other catalog of the cover images and interior images and things, and I'm slowly, as time and money permit me to, trying to amass so I have all of the flyers that I showed pictures of from the different collections. I have those in my own collection, and I try little by little, anytime I find little snippets here and there, try and, house them, so they can hopefully be in some place in the future, but yeah.
I want to ask one follow-up question. I'm sorry to focus so much on this, but it's like now making sense. So I'm wondering if during your talk and also like thinking about this with collecting, is there anything that you have noticed or as part of your larger project that is worth sort of talking about now that has to do with the physical production, right? Because you're talking about how there's all these local markets, but like, are the binderies different locally? Are there,
So
and
I
I'm
will,
thinking
yeah.
also of Magalí also because of the labor conditions of people who are physically producing the books in each of these regional.
Yeah, no, I was actually thinking a lot about kind of like weirdly other side of coin production
Yeah.
distribution. So Jackson is fascinating for a number of reasons, and this is kind of part of a larger project that is supposed to focus on other presses, but I don't know, I feel like now I just feel like I want to spend all the time with Jackson. So he has two early on, I think it's in like 1919, he starts presses and binderies in Sao Paulo and Buenos Aires, which is kind of fabulous because he's allowed to kind of do everything there. So his bindery, so all of these books have pretty much the same binding, they just have different, the hardcover ones all seem to have the Cumbre mark on them, whereas the paperback ones have the Jackson. And in terms of kind of the local character, I mean, just thinking more about the content in terms of what the genre is, but it seems like they're very uniform, even though the cover designs are radically different. They're quite uniform book to book to book, and they're exactly the paperback. And at least speaking about Murder by the Book, the paperback edition and the hardcover are the exact same translation, probably exact same plates used to print it. I found kind of similar type damage between at least the two copies that I have. I don't really know which number in the 8,000 print run they are, but they have similar kind of marks that indicate that they were probably the same plates.
This is that you answered the question that I was going to ask, but I was also going to ask it of the final and then also the first paper as well, because one of the through lines is really this repackaging. So I am interested, like on a bibliographic level, and you sort of talked about this, but I need to know: are they printed from the same setting of type in these different formats? And it's really the kind of reconfiguration of it in the exact same way that you were talking about, like whether it's a hardback or a paperback, it's the same printing, it's the same.
Digital file.
Yeah, digital file,
Yeah.
exactly. And it's just being sort of like expressed using different equipment or different things. But then I also wonder if you wanted to reflect on that in the first instance, like, do you find that also happening in an environment where a lot of publishing is from digital files? So that despite this sort of very vibrant and interpretive material environment, that like the kind of the bibliographic level is continuity.
Yeah. I mean, in the case of the trade edition and the die-cut book, it is the exact same digital file, and
Yeah.
then the production of the binding and the cutting is what made it different. The file for the card catalog is different, as is, I guess, the small database that goes into the web app. Indeed, there's this is one of the interesting, again, like pulling apart and bringing together situations that happen in the work. Is there's fragments that are different because they are self-reflexive. So the ones that are in the trade book will mention the trade book. The ones that are in the card catalog will mention the card catalog. The ones that are on the web app will mention the web app. So they can be a little bit different, but essentially they are the same. There's just like small adaptations that signal the specific book object that you're holding, essentially, and that is kind of like hints at, again, this dispersion but cohesion at the same time. Yeah. So the answer is both. There's the same digital file as well as some differences too. And just to cite them and to manage them, the article that I wrote on Permanente, Obra, Negra was the most difficult one to document because you're repeating the same thing with just the slightest variation, and then it is the same citation with the slightest variation. I went crazy. No, I was there. I'm like,
I remember reading a lot of
iterations.
iterations. I was like, okay, I can see that.
How do I do this? I need help. Yes.
It's. I think one of the things I see is that the continuity is often a sign of the proximity, politically, affectively, of the presses that the files are moving between, right? So, Tinta Limón and Bajo Tierra, the Argentina editor and the Mexican editor, are actually very dear editing friends, and they started a new bookstore in Mexico City together recently. They do the book fair circuit together. So actually the Argentine edition of my book was on the shelves of the Mexico City bookstore for a year before the Mexican edition came out. So it was there. It wasn't this need to produce the local edition because it couldn't get there, right? It was already there, but they wanted to do it for all these other kinds of reasons. But so there you see it's the same digital file, and it's a nice clean digital file. I say that because in other cases it's the same digital file that I see in reproductions of books, but it's like a really dirty scan, right? That's then been reprinted, right? In the case of, for example, this fantastic press in the city of Resistencia, Argentina, which I have to say where they're from because it's so cool. This town called Resistencia. And they have reprinted a number of books actually about copyleft politics from Spanish press, Traficantes de Sueños, which is the third part of this love triangle of the Argentine and Mexican presses. But they have just, taken these books that they have access to and literally scan them or photocopy them and then use that as the digital file as the basis for their books. So then you have these brand new covers, you have a new copyright page that's way more open than the original Creative Commons one from Spain, for example, where they're just like, copyleft and fuck you all, right? But then inside it's like exactly the same. It's maybe like a little crooked inside, like literally, right? But yeah, but in other cases, presses like when Bajo Tierra in Mexico City, when they produced the new edition of Autonomías y Emancipaciones from Urtzibeki, they were just the second press to edit it, and they actually decided that they wanted to do like a lot of new copy editing because they weren't really pleased with the copy editing on the original edition, and so they produced a new file that was quite different, right? And they talk about that first edition was like a little sloppy, and so we had to do this, right? So sometimes it's things like that. That particular book, which is also sometimes called Territorios en Resistencia, I showed the different images. Sometimes it's a horizontal format. It's like it changes so much, and sometimes it's 12 chapters and sometimes it's 5, but it's the same book, right? So those kind of differences.
Maybe just a quick follow-up on that. I was, as you were saying this, I was thinking that kind of like having some sense of these publishers, that when you were showing the editions of Tinta Limón and Bajo Tierra, I was thinking of Traficantes.
Yeah.
And I wonder, because to a certain degree, you could maybe argue that what they're doing is sort of reproducing the hegemony of these kind of major, historical, areas of publishing. But what it seems like also there's obviously a different distribution network. So I was wondering, one of the things that seems like that's also being challenged in what you're saying through the publishers as well as through the book is the hegemony of like the publishers of other publishers, commercial publishers, multinational publishers. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that, because it's such an interesting thing that I think of this collaboration that's happening. Having the bookstore, the physical sort of stuff, in ways in which they're kind of working outside of that. I mean, I know it's implied in a lot of what you're saying, but it's just specifically that relationship to the normal routes of distribution and how they're kind of challenging that or contesting that.
Yeah, because it's absolutely, it's Madrid, Buenos Aires, Mexico City. It doesn't get any more, and also there's that tie-in of Madrid is complicated, right? Because still so much Latin American publishing goes literally through Spain with books. It's not hard to import books from Spain, right? It's hard to import a book from Ecuador to Bolivia, but we can get the books from Spain just fine, right? So there's all kinds of weird circuit stuff going on. But these presses really, even these, Tinta Limón and Traficantes de Sueños are powerhouse, very established leftist presses, right? They are very well known, very established, very even, I don't know if I don't want to say commercial, but right, you can find them and they've been in export for a long time already. But they are very actively trying to cultivate these other circuits, right? And part of what they've been doing, so the new bookstore in Mexico City is first and foremost a social center with a bookstore, right? It's called a lugar común, right? It's a common space. Volcana is the main name. And that's been kind of an offshoot of what they've been doing through book fairs, right? So doing these shared book stands it's a project called Todo Libro es Político, all books are political, right? And so they kind of gave that a permanent home. But I feel like the bookstore is kind of almost like a books fair stand in a permanent space, right? So it's kind of brings that energy of the book fair that has been really important to them to a kind of fixed space. But yeah, the book fair circuit is essential for all of these, and they're very intentionally, even those that have access to bookstores and have access to the distribution that gets you into bookstores internationally, even those are really committed to continuing to kind of nourish those other spaces, knowing that for most of the presses it's an impossibility to be in the bookstores. Even Bajo Tierra, they're yeah, sure, we bring our books to the Gandhi bookstore, the big bookstore in Mexico City, but they're we just know that they end up on the floor, getting stepped on, and the markup is ridiculous, and they aren't really even interested in making those circuits their main ones, right? Marcy?
First of all, thank you so much for a fantastic panel, giving us so much to think about in beautiful examples, very different and great examples. And I had one comment kind of for everybody, but a little bit more for Magalí, that and you do this of course throughout your book, which I love so much, but I just wanted to point out that in this panel on materialities, there's so much happening about place. And even in Elika's presentation, place including, a digital place. So I think that's really important, and I think Magalí, and your research throughout, you've been very conscious of the place-based importance of so many of these projects, and even in the example of this sort of triumvirate of international presses that are a little bit better known and maybe a little more established, the sort of back room, marginal barrio kind of production that you also cover a lot is really, really important. And so there's kind of the materiality, but also the materiality of place and affect. I think that's another thing that we see are these friendships, connections, outreach, commitments, feminist, labor, a lot of different things. So I think that's really interesting. And I knew nothing about these book clubs, so that was really fascinating. And again, like you emphasized, the place-based, having kind of like a marca local for each one to kind of bring people in. It was a marketing strategy, but it worked. And because so much in Latin America, it's that little barrio, the little club de football, the little local thing. So that was really, really interesting. So thank you for that.
In a weird way, I was gonna say, even though mine seems more kind of I don't want to say pyramid schemey, but kind of pyramid schemey. Because people kind of entered this when they were like 12 or 13 in certain places as like jobbers, like they'd run around and try and get people to subscribe, and then they would stay on and get promoted and then be a manager, then run this press. And so it seems like people also kind of were committed to this like family of once they were in, you know, they were there, although more kind of pyramid schemey and not as like rough, more like, but still, there was still that like place and dedication to kind of the initiative, shall we say. Yeah.
I'm gonna look for your article on Permanente, Obra, Negra, and I can't imagine how complicated it was to describe these things. So I really wanna learn from that, but I think also I couldn't help but think of Cortázar and Último Round.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
And the kind of vanguardia in some of the boom writers that I think laid some of the groundwork for that kind of, you know, pretty radical aesthetic production.
Yes, oh, absolutely. I mean, Abenshushan has all of that repertoire like coming in, and she actually uses some of their like actual citations in one of the series that are like her sources, I guess. And similarly, she is an editor herself. She was one of the head editors in Tumbona Ediciones, a small independent publisher in Mexico too. That also kind of like brings out this extra knowledge of how the industry functions and creates the connections in between the editors at Sexto Piso, the developers at Media Lab MX, and the different workshops, like who's doing artisanal binding, who's doing just like regular printing, binding, production, and so on and so on. So absolutely, yeah, I think it follows on kind of like a post-boom, post-vanguardias, and so on and so on, yes, which is a very strong literary movement in Mexico in the last 10 years or so, yeah, thank you, Marcia.
It's actually a Tumbona book that's photocopied and reprinted in Resistencia Argentina also.
There you go, yes. And also has very interesting paratexts, if anyone is interested.
Thank you so much, Elika, Nora, Magalí. Well, now we have, thanks to Erin and BSA, we have a little get together, and so please continue with the conversations with each of our presenters, on one or however you want to, but also enjoy the food and the drinks. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It is crazy, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Gracias, Vale. No, se vendían solitos. Y bueno, realmente
Es interesante que no se vendieran, o sea, nunca se presentaban juntos.
solamente las presentaciones, cuando recién salió. En las ferias yo creo que también, yo creo que nunca tuve la oportunidad de ir a las ferias. Salió en el 19, entonces realmente cuando le tocaba ir a las ferias era ya la pandemia. Entonces, bueno, ahí hubo problemas, ¿no? Pero no, o sea, este se encuentra por donde sea. Las otras, bueno, las vende Vivian misma, básicamente, ¿no? Sí.
Creo que
Ajá. No, las otras, sí. Es que es un lío, o sea, en el artículo cuando lo estaba escribiendo, de verdad que yo le mandaba un mensaje a Nora de cómo cito todas estas cosas que son la misma obra pero que son diferentes objetos. Y fue así como mi Baptism by Fire con bibliography y Descriptive bibliography, eso porque fue... Dice muchísimo. Sí. De un banco. Más, sí, mucho más, sí, que Sexto Piso diría uno, bueno, pero no, realmente Vancomer es el que está detrás de todo el proyecto. Sí, bueno, Vivian es muy accesible, entonces si no la conocen les puedo mandar un correo para conectarla y ver si todavía tiene copias para que sí.
yo creo que catalogarlo de tal manera, porque eso es lo que no tenía yo porque me ganaron mi lugar.
Ajá.
Cómo en Wonka? ¿Cómo se catalogó?
Bueno, es que
¿Cuántas bibliotecas realmente tenemos?
Es que, lo que pasa, pero es que también hay otra cosa que ya no tuve tiempo de mencionar, pero es que si ves aquí hay un ISBN y bueno, como el libro sojado es la misma impresión, trae el mismo ISBN, pero el catálogo no tiene ISBN.
Pero a la hora de catalogar.
El fichero no tiene.
Las otras partes